fairly rapid succession. On March 12th, okay, yeah, okay. I'm clicking it, but it's not responding. Yeah, good. Here, Doug, I'll let you do it. So what? Oh, no, it didn't. There we go. Sorry about that. As I said, we have a couple of speakers coming in rapid succession following this evening's program, and I'd like just to say something super quickly about those. On March 12th, just 2 weeks from tonight, retired Stanford history professor Dr. Estelle Friedman will be our Women's History Month speaker for the Said to Sherborn program. Drawing from her several books, Dr. Friedman will explore the Sherborn Reformatory in the context of turn of the 20th century women's prison reform, with a focus on Miriam Van Waters, the reformatory's brilliant superintendent, who now rests in our own Pine Hill Cemetery. Friedman's superb biography, Maternal Justice, is available here at the library. Not long thereafter, on Wednesday, April 3rd, Dr. Christoph Strobel, chair of the UMass UMass Lowell History Department, will further explore and expand upon certain themes from tonight's talk. Dr. Strobel is the author of an excellent recent book, Native Americans of New England, which is also available in the stacks here. So keep an eye out for the mailings on those programs. Okay, so on to tonight's session, honoring Indigenous history, the Eliot Indian Bible, and the Natick Praying Indians. Doug Brown's 35-year professional career has taken him through the law, government, and healthcare. He currently serves as president of Community Hospitals and chief administrative officer for UMass Memorial Health in Worcester. Doug and his wife, Jennifer, have lived in Sherborn for 2 decades and have 2 adult children, Connor and Caroline. Over these years, he's developed a keen interest in local history and now serves as vice president of the Sherborn Historical Society. Doug was elected into membership of the American Antiquarian Society in 2021 and currently serves on its governing council. He is also a member of the Grolier Club in New York City, the Caxton Club in Chicago, and the Tickner Society in Boston. Of note, Doug has a passion for collecting antiquarian books on early America, mostly in the area of history, law, and justice. Many of the books in his collection were used as sources for this talk, and he's brought some of them to share with anyone interested in later viewing them. Doug Brown.
Thank you so much. And it's so great to be here and see such interest in history. It warms my heart, truly. So great to have you and see so many old friends and new ones as well. So let's dive in. In 1621, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag Indians, participated in what we now call the First Thanksgiving. He was joined by about 90 members of his tribe. This man of peace would never have imagined that 55 years later, his son's head would hang on a pole near the very same Plymouth site of that first dinner. It would remain there for 20 years, giving passersby the chance to see the decaying head of the most feared and hated man in America. So what happened? My talk will attempt to answer that question, and it will focus primarily on a period of 40 years between 1650 and 1690. This was an enormously consequential period in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and in our nascent town. My talk will differ from most conventional talks of this period because I will focus primarily on a group of Native Americans called the Praying Indians. I do so because this group has been woefully underrepresented in our history, and I believe their story is vitally important to tell. I'm going to tell this story largely through the eyes of 4 men, 2 English and 2 Native. by giving you some insight into their overlapping personal stories. I hope it will help you gain a deeper understanding of this fascinating period in our history. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Before we dive in, I offer two disclaimers. First, I am at best an amateur historian, with an emphasis on the word amateur. Amateurs, by definition, are imperfect, and I am no exception. I have certainly tried my best, but if you want to get closer to perfection, I suggest that you seek out our fabulous historian, Betsy Johnson, who's I'm going to embarrass and is here with us this evening. Second, I am very mindful of the fact that I am a white man telling the story of Native Americans, and my perspective may be fraught with unconscious bias. Again, I've tried my best to lift up their story authentically, but you would learn more from someone with lived experience. And the praying Indians have been very interested, as you may know, in this story. And at the Unitarian Church, we've made some deep connections with them. And I hope you will participate in that and seek them out for fellowship, connection, and conversation. I will talk for about 40 minutes, followed by 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. I will stay later if anyone wants to continue the dialogue. To accompany the talk, I prepared a chronology of events, brief descriptions of our main characters, and a descriptive bibliography. If you haven't gotten one, you should get one. It might help you follow the tale I'm going to tell. And finally, as Kevin said, I brought with me some books in my collection. They are all over here. I encourage you, for anyone interested, to take a look at them afterwards. The ones that are a little bit more old and sensitive, one is 350 years old, so they're under wraps. I ask you to just keep them that way if you don't mind, but please enjoy them if you're interested. All right, so shall we dive in? Awesome. This is a wild ride, so buckle up and get ready. This is a picture of that son of Massasoit I described earlier. His name was Metacom, or King Philip, as the English called him. This picture is the most famous and well-known picture of him. It is how many perceive him today. The only problem is, it is not him. It is an engraving that was done by Paul Revere in 1772. And it was copied from a print Revere found of a Canadian Mohawk Indian chief. You can see the resemblance. The original engraving is on the left. You can see the similarity in the facial features, in how the body is placed, and in the clothing. But just imagine for a second how members of the Wampanoag tribe today must feel in knowing that the picture most widely circulated of their great leader is actually a chief from their arch enemies at the time. And this serves as a perfect metaphor for my talk. History is not always what it seems. Winston Churchill said that history is told by the victors. And that is especially true of King Philip's War and the period we will discuss. All of the contemporary narratives were written by white English men, and it turns out they left a lot out of the story. We will try to correct that this evening. We begin our story in 1652. It was an important year for our town, as our first English inhabitants were making settlements along what is now Bullard Street near the Millis line. The entire area was wilderness, and Sherborn, which was then known as Bogastow Farms, was one of the first settlements on a new frontier west of the Charles River. Most of the inhabitants of the area at the time were Indigenous peoples, primarily from those of the Nipmuc and Massachusetts tribes. What did the area look like? The area was densely covered with massive and towering trees. The uplands were burned by the natives to hasten vegetation for deer. Trees were trimmed by flames that allowed for extensive views. There were numerous meadows with nutritious grasses. There were no roads, and the area had wild animals, including moose, bear, and panther. And you thought poison ivy was dangerous. By the way, Liz, am I doing the screen right online? Oh, oh, thank you. Thank you. Good. As our first settlers were clearing their land, there was some other activity going on just down the road in Natick. The Puritans were engaged in missionary work to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. Puritans at the time believed that it served God's will to save Native Americans from their wild and primitive ways and to teach them to be civilized citizens through the learnings of the Bible. While we know this today to be an ethnocentric view, it was a genuinely held religious belief by many at the time. But why would some Native Americans want to convert to Christianity? For one, they hoped the English God would prevent further epidemics that had devastated their communities. But they also wanted to find connection with their new English neighbors and to explore new spiritual principles that they hoped fit within their worldview. These four men are the key characters in our story, and they all played a leading role in this effort. The first was a man named John Eliot. He arrived here in 1631 and became a minister at the first church in Roxbury. He founded a Latin grammar school called Roxbury Latin, which still exists today. We have a graduate in our front row. But his greatest passion was to guide the Native Americans in the path to Christianity. He was known as the apostle to the Indians for his commitment to Native peoples. Here he is preaching to the Indians in surroundings that probably looked pretty similar to our town, tall trees and wide vistas. Eliot partnered with a man named Daniel Gookin, the second character in our drama. We don't have a picture of Daniel Gookin, but we do have his family crest. Gookin lived in Cambridge and was a magistrate in government and one of the busiest men in the colony. He attended legislative sessions, served on committees, was active in his church, tended to his farm. But like Eliot, his most passionate work was in his role as superintendent of the Praying Indians. Together, Eliot and Gookin helped to establish villages throughout Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Praying Indians who had converted to Christianity. The most famous of these was 3 miles down the road in what is now South Natick. And that brings us to the third character in our drama, and his name was Wasaus, or as the English called him, John Sassamon. Sassamon was from the Massachusetts tribe and grew up in the Canton area. He lost both of his parents to smallpox when he was 13, so he was taken in by an English family and taught to read and write English. He became well educated and attended Harvard College for a year in 1653. Sassamon worked closely with John Eliot, and he was among the first leaders to settle Natick as a praying town in 1651. He helped to build the first meeting house there and served as a schoolmaster. He also served as Eliot's translator when Eliot preached to the Native Americans. Now, John Eliot had one major obstacle in his work. How could he effectively teach the Bible to Native Americans if they could not read or write English? His answer was to translate the Bible into the native language. So working with John Sassamon and a few others, he launched a 12-year effort to translate the Bible into Algonquin. This was immensely difficult. The Massachusetts language was largely an oral tradition and only existed in print form for about 10 years prior to Eliot starting his work. But the printing was even harder. The only printing press in America was at the newly established Harvard Indian College in Cambridge. Eliot worked with some English printers, but for the Bible, he needed someone who spoke Algonquin. So he recruited a Native American boy named Wawus, or James Printer, as he was later known, and he is the fourth and final character in our story. James was a Nipmuc Indian born in 1640. He grew up in the praying town of Hassanamesset, near what is now Grafton, Massachusetts. His father converted to Christianity under the guidance of John Eliot and became a leader in the church at Hassanamesset. James was sent to the Roxbury Latin School, which educated students in Latin literature, moral citizenship, and lessons in Christianity and spirituality. After Roxbury Latin, James became an apprentice in the print shop of Samuel Green at the Harvard Indian College. Now, in order to print the Indian Bible, the press required a manual process that could print only one page at a time. Imagine that today. One page at a time back then. The Bible contains a total of 1,180 pages, and each page required the manual setting of over 4,000 movable type characters. James was critical to this process because he was bilingual. He understood entire Algonquin phrases and not just letters. This allowed him to be far more efficient in setting the type than his English counterparts, who undoubtedly found the words incredibly confusing. The Bible was completed in 1663. This is a cover page of that Bible. And this is a page of text from the Bible that I'm delighted to say is in my collection and here with us today that you can see. Sadly, I could only afford a leaf of this Bible and not the entire Bible. I won't tell you how much the leaf costs, but it's a beautiful leaf. We mentioned 50 years old. Here is a close-up. This particular leaf has to do with, for those of you biblical scholars, with the Queen of Sheba going to visit King Solomon. You can see in the first words. But if you look at the text, you can see for someone who doesn't speak Algonquin, just how hard this would be to set the type. 1,000 copies were printed, enough for every praying Indian family throughout New England. The Eliot Indian Bible was the first Bible printed in America and was the first to be translated into a Native American language. It remains one of the rarest and most cherished books in America. Eliot deserves enormous credit, but James Printer was the true unsung hero. Okay, are we all doing okay? Because we're going to now get into the wild part of the ride. We're going to advance 8 years to 1675. Tensions were rising between the English and Native Americans, mostly around disputes over land. For Native Americans, property was a shared resource, available to everyone for different uses at different times. Not so for the English, who came with a mentality of clearly defined property rights. If it is mine, it is not yours, and if you use it without permission, it is trespassing. But interestingly, the English applied a different standard when it came to their cows. By the way, cows will take on a unique role in our story, as we'll talk about later. But the English believed that they had no responsibility for fencing in their cows. And as a result, English cows often trampled on and destroyed the crops of many native villages, exacerbating the tensions. We will now turn back to our friend John Sassamon from Natick. Do we remember him? All right. This is a great crowd, very smart crowd. Because it turns out he was a major factor in starting King Philip's War, but didn't even know it. Because he was conversant in both languages, and he was well educated, he traveled in both worlds, helping to facilitate relations between English and Native Americans. In addition to helping John Eliot, as I mentioned, he also helped Metacom learn to read English and became his aide and advisor. But Metacom did not take well to missionary activities, and there was always a level of mistrust he had with Sassamon. In late January of 1675, Sassamon learned that Metacom was planning an attack against the English. So he decided to walk 15 miles through snowy trails to warn Josiah Winslow, the governor of the Plymouth colony. He also told Winslow that he feared for his own life because if Metacom learned of this betrayal, he would surely have him killed. Winslow did not take the warning seriously and basically blew it off and did nothing about it, which, by the way, was not uncommon from some of the information provided by Native Americans. Within a few days, Sassamon went missing. His body was later found underneath the ice on Assawamsett Pond in Lakeville near his home. He appears to have been ice fishing. So this is a map just to show you where Assawamsett Pond is. If you look in the bottom right, where I put a pin right by Lakeville, that is where the pond, and we are up by that blue dot in the upper left. You'll see Medfield there just to get your bearings. This is a close-up of Assawamsett Pond, and on the left you'll see Sampson's Cove, and that was the actual place where John Sassamon was found. And this is a picture of it 3 years ago when I went there because I just had to see what it looked like. So that's Sampson's Cove in around the same time of year. So what exactly happened? Was he murdered? Was it an accident and he fell in the ice while ice fishing? Or was it suicide? Scholars have debated this for centuries, and we will never know the true story. What we do know is that the leaders in Plymouth Colony were absolutely certain it was murder arranged by King Philip. This is an 19th century depiction of that murder. You cannot see there's a murder weapon. There's a tomahawk in front, and this is a Native American attempting to push Sassamon under the ice to make it appear as if it was an accident. An eyewitness claimed to have seen 3 of King Philip's men murder Sassamon on the ice. These men were immediately charged and tried by a Plymouth court. Now, interestingly, this would normally fall within the jurisdiction of the Wampanoag tribe at the time under the existing rules, but the Plymouth colony refused to recognize their jurisdiction and assumed it for themselves. There were all sorts of irregularities in the trial that would never pass muster today. Nevertheless, all 3 men were convicted and quickly executed on June 6, 1675. King Philip was outraged. 2 weeks later, on June 20th, as tensions rose, a group of English soldiers marched toward Mount Hope in Bristol, Rhode Island, where Metacom lived. Late in that afternoon, they saw a full eclipse of the moon that stopped them dead in their tracks. It was an ominous sign, and some thought they saw a black spot in the moon that resembled the scalp of an Indian. 4 days later, the Wampanoags launched an attack on Swansea, killing 9 colonists, and King Philip's War had begun. The war lasted for 14 months, and by population, it remains the bloodiest and most savage war in American history. Thousands of lives were lost, houses were burned, and 12 entire towns were completely destroyed. It sent panic through the Massachusetts colony, and it took the colonies over 50 years to fully recover. But the losses were most severe on the Native American side. More than half of the 20,000 or so in southern New England either perished or were sold into slavery. Now, there were many horrible atrocities committed by both the English and the Native Americans. But the greatest victims of this war, in my opinion, were the praying Indians, because they were completely caught in the middle and horribly persecuted by both sides. And so it is on their plight that I will focus. On August 22nd, 7 colonists in Lancaster were murdered by an Indian raid. Captain Samuel Mosley wanted blood. Mosley was widely recognized as the cruelest military leader in the colonies. He once ordered a Native American woman to be torn to pieces by dogs. Our old friend James Printer had returned to his settlement at Hassanamessa when the war began. On August 21st, James had gone out hunting with some friends near Marlborough. They tracked and shot 3 deer, divided the meat, and went to Sunday services the next day. On August 30th, James Printer was at the praying village of Oconomowoc in Marlborough when Captain Mosley arrived with several soldiers. He had been given a tip that several praying Indians at Oconomowoc, including James Printer, were responsible for the raid at Lancaster. This was false, but it did not matter. Mosley forced James out of the fort at gunpoint. He shackled his arms behind his back and tied a rope around his neck. 11 men, all praying Indians, were tethered to each other and forced to march 30 miles to Cambridge, while Mosley's men on horseback pulled them with a rope. When they arrived in Cambridge, they were thrown in a stifling jail cell where they waited 3 weeks before getting any opportunity to be heard. All the while, our friend Daniel Gookin was the only man in government who pleaded incessantly for their innocence and for their release. One magistrate told Gookin that he was working so hard for the Indians that he, quote, ought rather to be confined among his Indians than to sit on the bench, end quote. A mob of over 40 English settlers stormed the jail, seeking to have the praying Indians executed on the spot. They barely escaped a lynching. With Gookin's help, they finally received a trial, and James and most of the others were completely acquitted of all the charges. The so-called bloody shirt, which was held up as a smoking gun, was determined to contain the blood of a deer during their hunting trip. The same day James was captured, August 30th, the Massachusetts Council issued an order confining all praying Indians to one of the 5 praying Indian towns. They were prohibited from traveling more than a mile from their settlements. And if they were found outside of this limit, they would be shot. They could no longer hunt or attend to their crops and cattle or attend to day labor. In October, in response to the continued hysteria against all Indians, the Massachusetts government ordered the praying Indians in Natick to be sent to Deer Island in Boston Harbor, even though they supported the English in the war. They remained there with praying Indians from other settlements for over 7 months. Gookin and Eliot were finally allowed to visit them in December, and they found about 500 starving men, women, and children. Gookin described the island as bleak and cold and said that the praying Indians suffered greatly, for they lived chiefly upon clams and shellfish that they dig out of the sand at low water. More than half of these praying Indians would die of starvation, illness, or exposure to the bitter cold by the time the war ended in 1676. On November 15th, the praying Indians were again targeted in Chelmsford. A barn was set on fire by some of King Philip's warriors, and the locals wrongly accused the praying Indians at the praying town of Wemesset for setting the fire. 14 armed men from Chelmsford stormed the village and demanded that the Indians come out of their wigwams. They readily complied. The men then proceeded to open fire and wounded 5 women and children. A daughter of a prominent Native American chief was wounded as she watched her 12-year-old son be shot and killed right beside her. Now, despite this hysteria, the English kept relying on praying Indians as scouts and guides to assist them in the war. And they were actually vital for the English winning the war in the end. Many of them served honorably. In December, the Massachusetts Council asked Daniel Gookin to get 2 praying Indians from Deer Island to serve as spies for the English to help get intelligence on the enemy. Gookin complied, and he found 2 outstanding praying Indians who infiltrated themselves into King Philip's settlement in central Massachusetts and returned to provide Gookin valuable information. They told him that King Philip was preparing another attack on the town of Lancaster. Gookin immediately alerted the authorities, but again, no one took him seriously. These two brave men risked their lives to get this intelligence, walked miles and miles through the snow back to Cambridge to deliver it. And yet when they returned, the anti-Indian sentiment was so strong that they were accused of conspiring with the enemy and immediately sent back to Deer Island. Lancaster was in fact attacked on February 10th, exactly as they had warned. The minister's house was burned and 40 hostages were taken, including the minister's wife, Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. She'll be coming back to us a little bit later. And that now brings us close to home, to the town of Medfield. Now, the first thing you need to understand about Medfield and Sherborn at the time is they were on the outermost fringes of the colony. This is the first map of New England that was done in 1677, around the time of the war. The orientation is confusing because west is up. But here is a close-up, and you can see the Charles River coming and going to Cambridge and Watertown and Dedham, and then you'll see Medfield. Of course, this was only a few years after Sherborn was incorporated, so it's not even on the map yet. But you can see how Medfield is. There's basically nothing to the west other than the Nipmuc country. So they really viewed themselves as right on the fringe. Now, this is Cotton Mather's map from about 25 years later, from a book he printed in 1702. And here's the close-up of this. And now you will know why so many people in our town refer to us as Sherborn, because that's exactly how Cotton Mather spelled the name of our town, Shirbon. I've never seen that spelling, but now it all makes sense. But you can see Sherborn and Medfield, Mendon had abandoned their town at the beginning of the war. So to the west, there was nothing, and they really felt that they were exposed. So they were on the outermost sentinel against the enemy's territory. As one later observer said, Medfield was like a rugged pine clinging to the top of the precipice when the storm has leveled every other tree in the forest. But that was all about to change. On February 14th, 4 days after the Lancaster raid, there was heard in Medfield the harrowing cry of a kennel of wolves, which was looked upon as an ominous foreshadowing of what might come. Perhaps that freaked out the minister at the time, Reverend John Wilson, who immediately whipped off an urgent letter to the governor. He alerted the governor of the imminent danger to both Medfield and, quote, ye village of Sherborn on the other side of the river, end quote. And then he said, and this is also a quote, be pleased for God's sakes to remember us, and let some considerable sufficient force be spent for our speedy relief before it be too late, lest Medfield be turned into ashes and smoke. Reverend Wilson got his wish. The force he asked for came. It included 80 soldiers on foot and 20 on horseback. This was in addition to the 100 men already in town under the command of Lieutenant Henry Adams. A total of 200 men. Medfield was never more safe or protected. Or was it? As residents slept on the evening of February 20th, between 300 and 1,000 Nipmuc Indians infiltrated through the town and went totally undetected. As the sun began to rise, they launched their surprise attack. Houses and barns were set on fire. Complete panic ensued. Lieutenant Henry Adams rushed out his door, half dressed, to take command of his men, and he was shot dead in his doorway. Some residents were killed as they attempted to flee to their neighbors. Fathers ran off with one child in one direction, while mothers took another child in another direction. John Fusel, 100 years old, weak and infirm, perished in his burning house. In all, 18 people were killed and half the houses in town were burned. One of the dead was from Sherborn. Jonathan Wood was on the bank of the Charles and was killed as he was tending to his cows. John Wilson, the Medfield minister, worried about the plight of others in Sherborn. In a letter to the governor immediately after the attack, he described the brutality and said, quote, "The Indians ran over the bridge, fired it as they left to Sherborn. We hope George Fairbanks' palisade is safe." Now, George Fairbanks was one of the first settlers of Sherborn, and he built a beautiful stone house and fort to help protect settlers from attack. It was on the north side of South End Pond, which today is on the Sherborn-Millis line on Bullard Street. And you can see Bullard Street on the left, which is Route 115. That parked car is mine, by the way, on the left. Sorry about that. And you can see where I've placed a pin right north of South End Pond is about where that fort is located. Now, the good news is that George Fairbanks' palisade was indeed safe. The Nipmuc warriors attempted to attack it after leaving Medfield, but they were repelled by our forebears in the fort who shot at them out the windows. This is a 19th century depiction. You can see the rifles out the windows. The warriors next attempted to burn the building by pushing a cart of burning flax. They apparently used flax a lot back then, down a hill, but fortunately the cart was stopped by a rock and the garrison was saved. This is a picture from the Sherborn history from the 1970s. Now, the stone house was torn down over a century ago, but here is a picture from the site of that house that I took just a few weeks ago. Now, how do I know that is the site? Well, a little over 10 years ago, a fabulous Millis historian by the name of Paul LaCroix, who happens to be with us this evening, was determined to find the site that had been lost for over a century. He was taking residents on a tour of the area, which he did periodically. And on this day, he happened to see a few interesting stones that intrigued him. He struck gold. That led to a multi-year archaeological dig to find the remnants of the site, and found that he did. This is the entire foundation and walls, along with an unbelievable number of colonial artifacts. Here's another picture of that site, and our own Betsy Johnson participated in that process. And what's amazing is that they even found some Native American artifacts that date back 10,000 years. This is from Paul's book. Paul wrote a fabulous book, which I have as well for you to take a look at. But if you look at item M, sorry, it's the one on the bottom, the text is over it, but Paul is here, so you can talk to him all about this afterwards. That has been documented to be from the period of about 10,000 years ago. Now, the site was covered back up and protected for posterity, but the good news for all of you is that you can soon visit the same spot, because the old Milborn farm next month is being acquired by the trustees of reservations. It is a beautiful piece of property, and I hope you get a chance to visit. And when you do, you can come into my driveway and stop by and say hi. Now, two other interesting tidbits before we leave the fort. The stone house may or may not have also been the fort. Paul thinks there might have been a separate house and a fort. And if so, the fort was close by, but it is still waiting to be discovered. Also, the Sherborn man who was killed, Jonathan Wood, had a wife who was in the fort on the day of the raid. Our early histories tell us that she gave birth in that fort the very next day and died in childbirth. Her daughter Silence losing both of her parents within 2 days. Now, Betsy Johnson believes through her diligent research that Silence may not have been born until several months later. But our early historians did not let the facts get in the way of a good story, so neither shall I. Sorry, Betsy. One last item before we leave Medfield. As the warriors left Medfield and went into Sherborn, they set fire to a bridge. Most of our histories say this was Death's Bridge, which you can see here, which is very close to the present-day bridge on Route 27. But again, Betsy and Paul's vigorous research has discovered that Death's Bridge probably did not exist at this time, so the actual bridge they burned was probably further to the south. But what we do know unequivocally is that King Philip's warriors left a famous note on a tree near that bridge. Let me read that note to you. Thou English man hath provoked us to anger and wrath, and we care not though we have war with thee this 21 years, for there are many of us, 300 of which have fought with thee at this time. We have nothing but our lives to lose, but thou hast many fair houses, cattle, and much good things. Now, scholars are fairly certain that this note was written by our friend James Printer, who at this time was embedded with King Philip's warriors. What we don't know, and what scholars have debated for years, is whether the note expresses James' own views after all he went through, and who could blame him, or whether he was simply serving as the translator and scribe for others, as he had done on so many other occasions. The other interesting thing about this note is its focus on cattle. I told you earlier we would return to cows. This was meant to mock the English obsession with material things, including their fair houses, cattle, and much good things. Native Americans did not like this materialism and believed this obsession with cattle and other property was a big part of the reason for the problems. And 350 years later, it appears we are still obsessed with our cows. You may know this book. I read it to my kids when they were young. Perhaps inspired by James Printer, these cows also wrote a note of their own, but of a very different source. They threatened to go on a strike if they didn't get electric blankets to keep them warm. Now, fortunately, Farmer Brown acquiesced. Now, you may be thinking, my name is Brown, but I can assure you, no one has ever mistaken me for a farmer. And I don't own cows, but I do own goats. Happily, they do not know how to type, and they are well fenced in. But I digress. The Medfield raid was the height of English anxiety over the war. The fact that King Philip's warriors were able to decimate a town while 200 soldiers were encamped there sent shockwaves through the colony. James Printer's note only heightened the fear and anger, and once again, the praying Indians became victims of the fallout. There was a plot to raid and kill all of the praying Indians remaining on Deer Island. Fortunately, it was barely averted. Daniel Gookin was not free from the English wrath. On February 28th, at the Blue Anchor Tavern in Cambridge, a Mr. Richard Scott entered the establishment and began screaming threats at Gookin. Gookin is an Irish dog that was never faithful to his country, the son of a whore, a bitch, a rogue. God confound him, and God rot his soul. I wish my knife and scissors were in his heart. Those are not ambiguous words. You can get a sense of the emotion at the time. In May, Mary Rowlandson, the Lancaster minister's wife, was released from captivity, and James Printer actually helped to negotiate for her release. That same month, the praying Indians were finally released from Deer Island, and Daniel Gookin and John Eliot were there to help them find comfort and shelter. But as a reward for all of his efforts, Gookin was voted out of office that same month, ending 20 years of impeccable government service. In August, Metacom's wife and child were captured and sent into slavery. The end was near. Metacom had gone back to his home at Mount Hope, perhaps preparing himself to die. On August 12th, Captain Benjamin Church led a group of men on a chase into the marsh where King Philip was shot and killed. Ironically, it was a praying Indian who led the way and fired the shot that formally ended the bloodiest war in America. Now, I will close by telling you what happened to our four leading characters. You already know what happened to John Sassamon. He does have a local golf course and the Natick High School yearbook named after him. But I believe we should remember him as a man who tried hard to navigate two worlds, but who was, in the end, never fully accepted by either. James Printer returned after the war to continue his work as a printer. In 1682, when Mary Rowlandson published her wildly popular narrative of her captivity, and I have a copy of that book as well, it was James who set the type. Imagine what he must have thought in witnessing everyone desperately wanting to hear about Mary Rowland's captivity, but no one caring about his. Daniel Gookin continued to fight for the rights of the praying Indians. He wrote about their awful treatment during the war and sent his manuscript to England to be published. His sponsors refused to do so because it didn't comport with the English narrative at the time. It was lost to history for 150 years until it was miraculously discovered and sent to Worcester, Massachusetts in 1836, where it was there published by the American Antiquarian Society. Here's a cover page of that narrative. And again, I have a copy of that book for anyone interested in taking a look. Gookin recommended his son, also named Daniel, as the first minister in a new church that was just being established in a fabulous town called Sherborn. And that son continued to carry on the tradition of his father in preaching to the praying Indians in Natick. And we know that many members of this community joined him to participate. I think we should all be very proud of that, especially in light of some of the behavior we saw in other towns. The first parish at Sherborn was formally established in 1685. On March 26th of that year, Daniel Gookin came to town to watch the ordination of his son. And by the way, we have that son's successor with us today. Nathan Dietering is the current minister. Nathan, thank you for being here. Most of the Eliot Indian Bibles were destroyed in the war, but in 1685, a second edition of the Indian Bible was printed. And you can see it for yourself because one copy is on display at the Natick History Museum in South Natick. Daniel Gookin Sr. died on March 19, 1687. Samuel Sewall called him a right good man. It is said that Native Americans all over lamented his death with unfeigned sorrow. John Eliot outlived Gookin by 3 years. Before he died in 1690, he ordained a Native American in Natick named Daniel Tuckawampet, who preached there for many years and became the first native praying Indian minister in New England. I will end where I began with a word about King Philip. The highly effective tactics that he used in the war, incorporating the element of surprise, were called barbaric and primitive. But when those very same tactics were used 100 years later by George Washington, they were called brilliant and heroic. It is also interesting to note how our heroes and villains change over time. America's hatred of Metacom lasted for a long time. But by the time of the Revolutionary War, he started to become the original American hero, fighting to protect and defend America. Most likely, Metacom was not that much different from the other characters in our story, and for that matter, from all of us. Our hero, our villain. A son, a father, a husband, and a leader of his community, doing his best to defend and protect his homeland and his people. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And so we have times for Q&A. And I think what we'll do is if you're online, if you could type your question into the chat, Liz is manning that, and we will make sure we get to it. And we'll just alternate between in-person and online so everyone gets a chance if they have a question. So anyone have a question or a comment or a criticism, by the way, please.
You know about annual history that made him such extraordinarily so different from everybody else.
Yeah, that's a great question. And sure, the question was, what do I know about Daniel Gookin's history that made him kind of so different from everyone else? It's a really good question, and there is one biography about Gookin. His family was very close to Oliver Cromwell. We know that. We know that Cromwell sent him to a Caribbean island to try to create a settlement for people that never worked out. But he was a very pious man, very, very religious, really active in Massachusetts government. And I think he was by no means perfect, right? And he was bigoted in his religious views. He believed deeply in praying Indians, but he didn't have any time for other Native Americans who were on the other side, right? So we should remember that even men at the time who were anomalies, by today's standards, wouldn't be perfect. But I think it was probably mostly his deep religious belief and his sense of purpose and mission to the society, and as a Puritan to help, and had just a fundamental sense of fairness, I think. But it's a great question. Do we have a chat online? Oh, thank you for that question. It's a great question. We know a little about them. At the Unitarian Universalist Church, I participate on a land acknowledgement and reconciliation task force that is trying to grapple with this history. Many of my compatriots are in the room today, and they do incredible work. And we reached out and made connection with the Praying Indians. They visited our church a few months ago. We had an unbelievable conversation with them. We feel, as a member of our congregation, we just feel a deep connection to them. So they are still alive. They have powwows, they have events, and we're happy, if you're interested, to put you in touch and give you ways to maintain and develop connections with them. Anyone else here? Please.
There a specific location in Natick where the village was?
Yes, there is, and it's right in South Natick. So there's still a church there. The Natick Historical Society has a history museum there, and they do a phenomenal job. They do tours of that little area, but it's right there on Route 16 where there's still a church. There's right where the library is. It's all in that area. The falls are right there, and if you go into the history museum or if you schedule a tour, which we've done, you'll learn a lot. And as I mentioned in the materials, the Natick Historical Society website, which I've included for your reference, has a great background in a lot of this history. So if you're interested, it's a great way to learn about it. What? Burial ground is there as well, right? Should we go online? Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, where was the specific site of the initial Natick settlement of the Praying Indians? And I said it is right where South Natick is on Route 16.
How was Medicon being so? Heard it was talking by the English settlers.
Yeah, what I've read, and other experts in the room may correct me, but so Medicom had an older brother who was really set to take over, and then he died, and that's how Medicom came into his position. And so his brother was named Alexander, and I think it was after Philip of Macedonia, I guess it is, and Alexander the Great. And for some reason, they were comparing them to those individuals. Is that right, Betsy? Okay, good. I was worried there for a second. So in the room, Jim, did you have a question?
How many Bible total first iteration and the second one is
Very few first editions, and virtually all of them are in institutions. Samuel Sewall, when he went to visit his university in England, he donated a copy inscribed by him, which they bring out once a year. The American Antiquarian Society has a copy, I know, probably the Library of Congress, but there are very few. I think that if you were to try to buy one, it would probably be over $1 million today. The second edition is probably a little bit more available, but still extremely rare. I saw one on auction within the last 6 months. It went for $80,000 to $100,000, I think, which I thought was kind of a bargain. But there just aren't many. They're both exceedingly rare. Please.
This part of the students and from the city point, so when maybe the time right around first European settlers, was it both and then one in the Massachusetts tribes? And where were they getting along? That what was that scene about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think again, oh yeah, the question was what Native American tribes were around Massachusetts at this time, and did they get along? And I think the answer is some got along really well and some didn't. The English were desperate to try to divide and conquer. So when Metacom, who was leader of the Wampanoag tribe, was starting to cause this tension, the Massachusetts the English government worked to try to get other tribes to join the English side in the war. And there was a lot of kind of diplomacy and negotiation, and some did. So it was really pretty variable. There are some really good maps that show where the tribes were at the time. The Wampanoags are basically southeast. The Nipmucks were kind of central Massachusetts, coming into Sherborn. Massachusetts were east, and then there are many others to that. In the book that I have that contains Gookin's narrative, there's another work in that has a map. And if you want, I'll take it out. And it was by a guy named Albert Gallatin, who was a secretary of the Treasury, Jim. Yeah, was a specialist in Native American affairs. And this is a map of his view, anyway, of Native American tribes across the country. So I'm happy to show that to you if you're interested. Anything online, Liz? Okay, and read it. Well, is it a good comment or is it a criticism? Just kidding, of course. Calling in from Hassan and Method, Grafton. Wow. Oh, I know who this is because I think this is a colleague I work with who's a chief physician executive at UMass and also a history buff and lives in Grafton. I would just like to mention that the praying, who of course probably didn't want to be identified, but sorry, Steve. I would just like to mention that the praying Indians only achieved church status two places, Natick and the second one here in Grafton. The site in Natick is under the Natick Mall, I am told. The one in Grafton is on 400 acres of land that has never been built on and is currently undergoing intense exploration by archaeologists. Interesting. Please, in the back. Yeah, great question. So two-part question. The first was, what about King Philip's Lookout, which is at Rocky Narrows? Does that have any connection to the war? I don't know. Betsy does, and I'm glad she raised her hand. Please, and I'll repeat it on the microphone. She said the earliest reference to King Philip's Lookout was in the 1970s. So probably not. And as is typical, people think things happen. It's a very high point. So it would certainly make sense, right? That it was a lookout by King Philip or maybe preparing for the raid. But Betsy, it appears there's no evidence you found. Not yet. And what about Thomas Sawin? Because I don't know much about his history. Do you know? He leased. Did he? Okay, he was a facilitator, kind of a legal facilitator between the people in Sherborn and. And did he have a mill there too? There was a mill, and if I read correctly the history, weren't they required to provide corn from the mill to the Native Americans if they wanted it? Yes. They had first choice. So I see. So I don't know if anyone heard that, but Thomas Sawin took property right where Broadmoor is and agreed to put it in it. The Native Americans transferred the property to him on the condition that he started a mill there. And as Betsy said, normally in mill towns, the English always got first cracks. And if there's anything left over, maybe they'd give some to Native Americans. But at this mill, they had the first right to get corn from the mill. Did I get that? They could use the mill. Great, got it. Thank you. Okay, others. Yeah, that's a really good question. What I didn't include in my talk, because I didn't have time, was there was land that the English settlers around this time purchased from the Native Americans, and they were required to do so. And one thing that the English required, the English back in England, is that they had to give certain rights for use of the property to the Native Americans. Was it fair consideration? By today's standards, no way, right? It's like a few pounds, a bushel of, some jackets. I mean, it's ridiculous. But by those standards, I don't know the answer. I've read some say that it was, and some say it wasn't close. So others may have views in the room. My guess is it certainly wasn't fair consideration likely for the value of the land at the time. Paul, do you have an?
They probably thought they were getting the better part of the deal.
Right.
They weren't.
That's a great point. For those of you who didn't hear what Paul LaCroix said, Native Americans at the time had no concept of property, as we talked about earlier, right? It should just be everyone's to share. So they thought they were getting a great deal, no matter what they were getting at the time, right? And that was part of the issue. Thanks, Paul. Please. Who knows where Natick comes from? Please, just shout it out. But it didn't exist before. But do we know what it means? What is it? Doesn't it mean, like, I thought something about water? What does the term Natick mean? Did it have a meaning in Native American language? Does anyone know? Land of rolling hills. I've heard that people are nodding. Yep, land of rolling hills. That could be. There are plenty of rolling hills around. Interesting what I've learned from Paul is we think that Bogastow, the first name of Sherborn, is a Native American name. Paul has uncovered some fascinating evidence that thinks that may not be the case. There was a bog there, and it may be bog and stone, and the way they wrote it, well, it could have been bog a stone, improperly kind of transcribed. Now, is it true or not? But it's fascinating. We all think it's a Native American name, where it just tells you what history, you know, just don't trust it all. Paul, please. Yes.
But there is documentation in Harvard's book that being the first successful repulse of a Native American attack on Garrison.
Oh, did you hear that? I didn't. So in Hubbard's book, I have his book. Of course, sadly, it's not a first edition. It was printed probably 20 years ago, but it's the Green Book, and that is kind of the most well-known and comprehensive contemporary source. And Paul said, for those of you who couldn't hear, that Hubbard said that when it's a contemporary source document for this the fight at the Bullard Fort, and where those in the fort repelled the Indian attack. And according to Hubbard, it was the first time that an Indian attack like that had been repelled in the war. Interesting. Let's see. Let me just make sure I'm not neglecting people online. Are we okay, Liz? Can we? Okay, this is my understanding. My understanding is that the land in North Sherborn that our house sits on was purchased from the Nipmuc Indians in 1695. Do you know anything about that or other purchases? Betsy? It's so it's a complicated history, but the answer is it probably is. The land you're on, Samhain, Thomas Samhain, who we spoke about earlier, did have a land deal that involved the north of Sherborn. It could have been that. Betsy has told us that there were all sorts of disputes and questions about that initial grant anyway. Okay, please, why don't we go to you and then Bill?
Were the praying Indians called that just because they had converted to Christianity, and were they from different tribes, or how were they organized as praying Indians?
Yes, my understanding is that that's how they got the name, because all those Indians who agreed to convert to Christianity could come and live in one of the praying villages. So there were 7 original praying villages that were established, and then there were several more after that. I've listed the 7 in the attachments. That's how they got the name. There were natives, we believe, from a number of different tribes. The Massachusetts tribe, I think, probably mostly, but I think there were Indians from other tribes who were there. Now, if you think the Wampanoags, would they have, they were very much adverse to the English at the time. So my suspicion is it's not likely you'd have many Wampanoags who would want to do that, but certainly Massachusetts, and I imagine some others as well. And interestingly, which is a topic for another day, sadly, the praying Indians are not recognized as a formal tribe today. And it's kind of ironic and sad. They go back such history, and they have such profound history of our country, and have been persecuted in so many ways, and they're not recognized. Now, it has a lot to do with how the federal government does and thinks about this, and there's a lot of politics involved, but I find that, concerning. Bill, you, and then we'll go over there.
Also, on Bullard Street, like there are dozens of streets, the whole area named after Bullard.
I can, but Paul can do it a lot better because he's really researched this. Paul, do you want to take a stab, and I'll.
doesn't water so well, that's, you know. And it's, when it comes to the boundaries of the farm, I spent a lot of time doing like title search guides and know the property around where we did dig. And, Bullard, well, for example, the Memorial Farm, there was, Jack Kingsbury, argued that the land of the farm belonged to Benjamin Bullard, and we thought this whole farm. I kind of proved that it didn't. You know, it's just, you know, so much time has gone by that, you know, and it's easy to assume certain things like this, but yeah, the first time that piece of history mentioned. It's true, you know, people just, they write it in such a way as you think it's history, but it's not.
Right.
You know, so it's a mess.
Yeah. Okay, that's a fair answer. Yeah. There are a number of Bullards. The first was Benjamin, who was an original settler, and I believe is buried in the town's the oldest cemetery west of the Charles. For those of you who haven't seen it, you have to go see it. It's in Sherborn. You go south on 27, just after you pass Route 115. It's on the left. You'll never know it's there because it looks like you're going into a driveway. I think the number is 255 on the residence. Please go see it. It's an amazing place. So Benjamin Bullard, there were many offspring of Bullards, Bill. Sorry. What I will tell you is that our property, yours and mine, was originally owned by a guy named Ting, Edward Ting. Okay. Ting had two daughters who married interesting people. One of them married Daniel Gookin. Daniel Gookin Jr., I think, his second, the first minister, his second marriage, who devoted his life to helping the Indians. The other one married a governor of Massachusetts who owned a Native American as a slave. Imagine how shocked I was when I found that, our property. So, okay, sorry. Who did I? Yes, please.
You give us an update on preservation of the Solid House on South Street.
I cannot. Can anyone, Betsy, can you? Does anyone know? Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know that, but I'm sure that people in the Natick Museum will know all about it, but I don't. Let's see, anything else online, Liz? The name Natick comes from someone looked up Wikipedia. Wikipedia is, the name Natick comes from the language of the Massachusetts tribe. Is commonly thought to be place of hills. So you are correct. We do. Okay. We will look. I know I've kept you longer than you signed up for, but I'll stay all night. But yes, why don't we have one more question, and then I'm happy to stay after if anyone wants to talk or see the book. So please. A resource, great. Oh. Oh. Oh, that's fabulous. I'll repeat it for those online who didn't hear. The Partnership for Historic Boston has a great website. What's that? S. Boston's with an S. Historic Boston's. Has a great website with a lot of information on the Native American tribes and those who were owned as slaves. So please check that out. That's great to know. Thank you so much for that. All right, last question, please. Absolutely. In fact, I'll show up in your dining room and give it again. Yes, absolutely. It has been recorded, so we'll make it available to anyone who wants to see it, right? So for those who didn't hear, just email, if you haven't registered for the program, email Liz Anderson, who is the librarian, a wonderful librarian in Sherborn, and she will make sure you get it. Thank you again so much for your interest.